All right, we're going to jump in. We've got a few folks so far. We are recording, so I know we had to shift things. So appreciate you again, Steve, just your willingness to collaborate with the community.
Absolutely. And so sorry we had to reschedule things. Last week was company kickoff, which I completely had forgotten about in Chicago. We had almost 5,000 company leaders from Salesforce all piled into a room to listen to Mark Benioff talk about what the goals were for the year. And the only thing I really came away with was a cold, which I am currently fighting. So I apologize in advance if my voice is a little raspier than usual. I am currently powered by 3 cups of coffee and cold medication. So that's getting me through my day today.
Yay, science. Definitely appreciate you jumping in, especially with the cold. So I'm sure we're going to have a decent amount of folks. If you've got questions, just throw them into the chat. And just thank you again for joining. I know there's so much going on. Would love to hear more about that company kickoff, but I know that's on the down low, of course. But we've got Steve Hamrick, and then you're going to go through some Slack workspace security. I was lucky enough to sit in on one of these sessions with you, and it was amazing. Now, we're not a Grid customer, but I was still able to gain a ton of insight into Grid security and the other levels as well. So still super impactful and meaningful for me. And of course, we'll do some Q&A. Not going to spend a ton of time on me. You guys know me, Nicole Pomponio, King of Prussia, Slack community leader and director of delivery management and ops over at SaltClick. Huge Slack nerd. So excited to be listening in again to this session. And then obviously you're not Nicole Pomponio. That's a slide mistake, but you're Steve. So Steve, why don't I glaze past this one and then let you introduce yourself, and then we'll just jump right in to your amazing content.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. Steve Hamrick. I've been with Slack for 5 years. Originally, I was purpose hired to build out Slack's administration and security features in specific regulated industries. But we saw a benefit and capabilities that were necessary across all editions of Slack. So a lot of the features that I'm going to talk about today are ones that obviously I had personal involvement in building out. On my actual day job nowadays is to be more of an outbound product manager. So I get to work with customers like yourselves. I get to actually share the roadmap, the strategy. I do a lot of these sessions just to help customers understand why did we build what we built? How does it work? How to get the best advantage of it? How to get the best value out of Slack? I am available for parties. You can book me through your customer success manager if you have one. So always happy to chat in detail. I wanted to start with something silly because I always find that these meetings can sometimes be a little dry. And I wanted to do a quick BuzzFeed quiz. I know we've only got 3 participants, but I feel like we have a good chance of answering at least 6 of these questions correctly together. So I'm going to keep my eyes on the chat to see answers. So I'm hoping that people will chime in with answers to these questions, but let's get started. Let's start with, which planet is closest to the sun? Anyone know the answer to this one? Chat. Type it in. Okay. Mercury. All right, that's the first answer. We're going to throw it in. Hey, Mercury is correct. All right, we got 1 out of 9 so far. We're doing good. Also doesn't have an atmosphere. All right, next question. This is a geography question. How many states does the Appalachian Trail cross? 14, 7, 9, or 12? I have no idea. I know it's a lot of states because it's a long trail.
Yes.
Anyone want to take a wild guess? Anyone know the answer? No Googling, by the way. That's not going to be unfair. 9. I saw Jen say 9. No, it's 14. That's a lot of states.
A lot.
That's a lot more than I would have thought. All right. We're 1 for 9 so far. We can catch up here. Let's see. What is a group of otters called? I have no idea. A troop, a gaggle, a romp, a passel. A group of otters.
Gaggle sounds fun.
A gaggle sounds fun, but I feel like it's a gaggle of geeses.
I think so.
Adam says a troop. I'm going to go with troop. Nope, it's a romp. Now that's a trivia fact you can bring to your Friday Junior happy hour if you have one, or Friday happy hour. A romp. It does sound like a very interesting term for a group of otters. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, what is the best-selling book of all time? The Firm, Jurassic Park, The Women, or the Bible? Oh, Adam says the Bible. I'm going for the Bible. Yeah, that's pretty much me. All right, so we're catching back up now. Let's see. As of January 2025, who is the highest paid actress for a single production? Meryl Streep, Sandra Bullock, Tilda Swinton, or Emma Stone? I have no idea.
tricky
Emma
one.
Stone. Jen guesses Emma. It's Sandra Bullock. Wow.
Curveball. I was thinking Meryl
movie.
Streep.
70 million for Gravity. 70 million. They didn't actually put her in space, right? For Gravity.
I'm pretty sure they didn't.
I'm pretty sure that was CGI. How many events are currently active in the Summer Olympics? 37, 219. These seem like arbitrary numbers.
Yeah.
I don't think it's 37. And I don't think
400 sounds like a lot.
Yeah. Anybody want to take a guess? Is it 329, 219? I'm watching the chat. No one's going to guess. I'm going to guess 329. Jen was with me on the guess.
Jen was right there.
329. That's a lot of events. Unfortunately, I think thanks to a certain breakdancing Australian, we no longer have breakdancing at the Summer Olympics, which is sad.
Oh.
They'll
saw a lot of good Halloween costumes from that, though.
Yeah. Reagan messed it up for Goyos. Hold on. Which of these is not a prime number? That's kind of easy.
Well, Adam's going 1.
Yeah.
Chad's going 2.
Only divisible by 1 in itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it 2? No, it is 1. Adam had it right.
Nice.
I guess I would have failed 4th grade math, apparently. I got up to calculus, and apparently I can't. What country has the most languages spoken within its borders? India, Russia, Kenya, or Papua New Guinea? Let's say what? Any guesses? Any guesses? Any guesses? Let's say India. No, Papua New Guinea. Wow. How many are in there? 840 languages in. I didn't even know there were that many languages to begin with.
That's wild.
All right.
That's a lot.
Last question. The Devil Wears Prada Miranda Priestley is based upon which character? Anna Wintour, Nina Gracious, Kim Francis, or Heidi Klum? Anna Wintour. Adam Cameron right away. There we go. Yes. We got 4 out of 9. All right. That's a pretty good way to start. Let's go back to actual presentation content, the thing you came here for, so that I'm not wasting your time. That was fun. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Adam, for participating. All right. Let's get started with the actual content. I don't like starting any presentation without some sort of a disclaimer. So before I get into the agenda, a quick disclaimer. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is not necessarily the most exhaustive list of everything that you might do from the security and administration perspective in Slack. Whatever threats you might face might be unique to your situation. So it could be that you have certain things you're more or less concerned about, just depending on your environment. And I think in particular, one of the is that credentials can be stolen through a variety of means. I think that's the one most basic practice. So as far as what I've got as far as content, this is the layout. I try to tell it in the form of a story. So we start with how do we get users into Slack? How do we make sure that we're monitoring what they're doing once they're in Slack? So what kind of session utilization do they have? What kind of activities are they performing? We talk about how we can get them out of Slack, right? If we need to, including terminating the sessions, how we monitor which machines and devices they're actually using, whether that's on mobile and desktop. And then we get into the dark art of governing content and channels in Slack. I have the Q&A section at the end, but I'm going to keep my eyes on the chat. So if there are questions along the way, please feel free, raise your hand, drop a note in chat. I will be happy to answer it. Nicole mentioned this at the start. A lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is specific to Enterprise Grid, including things like session duration, session management, domain claiming, as best as possible where there are places where I can remember that it's included in either Biz Plus or Pro. I will definitely point it out. But I think in general, it's good to know these concepts, why they exist, why those features exist. It just adds context so that if you are thinking about potentially an upgrade down the line to Enterprise Grid, now you have some context as to why these things matter. So let's just start with getting users into Slack. Timely onboarding and offboarding of users is one of the most important and critical things to get right. If you do not terminate a user at the time that your employment with that person is terminated, you're risking the fact that they may try to take content out of your Slack instance. They might do something they're not supposed to. In some cases, for example, people are in Slack long after they're actually terminated with the company, and that presents a really big security risk. The other thing that is problematic is a lot of customers don't often employ multi-factor authentication. I can't endorse that enough. If you do have Slack and you're not using SSO, I still would strongly recommend taking a look at the support for multi-factor authentication. Slack has 2 different mechanisms for doing that. One is through SMS. The other one is through the app authenticator apps, including Google as an authenticator app. The authenticator apps actually tend to work better and more secure because SMS has a known attack vector, which is being able to clone a phone number and get the SMS code out of that phone number. So definitely suggest using the authenticator apps over SMS as a method of doing multi-factor authentication. However, just as general best practice, using your identity provider, doing IDP group and user assignments, putting those folks in the right workspaces, in the right channels in Slack from the beginning is definitely a good practice. We support out of the box SCIM and SAML as standards. So we integrate out of the box with things like Okta, Azure, OneLogin, and a lot more. Now, one of the things that customers don't always know is that we also support provisioning for guest user accounts. A lot of the guest user accounts actually are a source of people being left in Slack for a lot longer than they should be. A lot of customers are actually using guest users as a way of having a limited access role. So I might have an intern, a co-op, a part-time employee, a contractor. In all these cases, I need them to be in Slack for a specified duration of time. I don't want them to be in Slack forever and ever in perpetuity. I may just want them to be around in Slack for the time that they're doing the work for me. For that reason, you can actually provision users as a guest user. So there is a way to use SCIM provisioning. This works in Okta and in Intra ID as well. And using SAML SSO, you can also restrain those people from only logging in using company-approved devices, which tends to be another problem. In fact, if there is a number one security risk I have seen in the last year and a half or so, it's the rise of malwares that includes stealers, basically. The Redline malware is one in particular, Redline stealer malware, where people are basically just scraping all of the cookie content, all the session content off of the device, cloning that, sending that out to the dark web, and then opportunistic hackers are basically taking advantage of those available tokens. And especially because in a lot of cases, those contractors are doing work for multiple organizations, that just represents a really big risk. So anything you can do to set up a secure entry point for them and also make sure that they're using company-approved devices is a good best practice. If you're not on grid, the other recommendation is to leverage the expiration for guest users, which you can enforce. So you can enforce that a guest user has a specific expiration date, so they're out of Slack at a specific time frame. I know I'm going kind of fast, but as I said, I'm powered by caffeine today. Next one is actually once they get into Slack. Now for grid specifically, there's a way to get an active list of sessions out of Slack. That's the admin user session list API. A lot of our customers use this in conjunction with a tool to monitor the available hours. So if you have part-time hourly workers, you want to get them out of Slack when they're not on shift, you can use the session list API to look at who's signed in at a given time and then sign them out if they're signed in during a non-work hour, for example. Again, this information is available in the audit log. And if you're on like the Pro plan, for example, there's actually information in the access logs that let you know where users are signed in from. But specific to grid is the admin session user list API. Now, once they're in Slack, the question is, what are they actually doing? So for Biz Plus and for Enterprise specifically, there's the audit log API that allows you to ingest the information about what users are doing. That includes a wealth of information, including the device they're doing it from, what kinds of activities they're taking. So are they creating channels? Are they uploading files? Are they downloading files? Most of our customers end up ingesting these events into a security information events monitoring solution like Splunk, Panther, or Microsoft Defender, and then they take automated actions. So if, for example, someone starts mass uploading a lot of content or mass downloading a lot of content, or if they start creating channels or if they start previewing channels, and these are things that from your organization's perspective should never really be allowed in Slack, or maybe it's just an overutilization of Slack, you might want to either investigate and have a conversation with that user about what they're doing in Slack and or actively terminate that session and maybe even lock the upstream SSO account. In particular, there's a category of events that go into the audit log that we call anomaly events. Now, these events are things like if that user is downloading a lot of files, if they're uploading a lot of files, if they've uploaded malware into a channel. We actually have a malware scanner natively baked into Slack. If their IP address is switching back and forth, so if they're geo-hopping, if it looks like their device suddenly went from West Coast to East Coast back to West Coast again, if they start searching for a lot of content in Slack, or if it looks like taking their credentials and actually started using it in a command line tool to scrape content out of Slack, these are all really high alerts anomalies anomalies that probably should be responded to. Now, I will admit certain of these anomalies are a little bit chatty. The IP address mismatch and the user mismatch can have legitimate reasons why those happen. So it includes being able to jump on a plane Wi-Fi or a hotel Wi-Fi and then maybe switching quickly to a hotspot. That could cause an IP address mismatch. Same with user agent. It could be that I patch my Windows OS or I patch my Mac OS or I upgrade the client that I'm on. And so the user agent string is going to not match. So those are both ones that tend to be a little chatty, but others are a little less chatty and probably ones worth really paying attention to, like unexpected scraping or excessive downloads. In both of those cases, you can potentially catch someone that is trying to mass exfiltrate content out of your Slack or mass download content. The way to think about it is that this threat is not necessarily just coming from outside threat actors, but potentially you've got employees inside the organization that for various reasons may be incentivized to do things that you don't want them to do, right? Like mass download content right before they leave your organization. All right, moving on to, okay, so far we've got how you get users in, get up to channels, talking about how we monitor what they're doing. Setting the session duration is really important. So the SSO basically tells us that yes, their credentials are correct. Let's start a session in Slack. And once that session started, we don't get a signal from the SSO provider for single sign out. We don't have any signal from the SSO provider to know, hey, this user should be off of Slack. A lot of organizations also make the choice to have indefinite session duration, which means the user's never requested to reauthorize their account back against the SSO or back against their password and username and password. The benefit and the value of having that frequent sign-in, and I should say frequent depends on your organization. Every organization sets their session duration slightly different, is that you're double checking to make sure that the users still got active credentials, they've still got rights to being using Slack, and that their session token isn't being misused in a way where it's been stolen, for example, through one of those malware stealers I mentioned earlier. So setting a reasonable session duration is a really good advisable practice. Historically in Slack, we used to not enforce that there be a default session duration. The reason for this was that years and years ago, we didn't support any notifications that you were approaching your session duration limit or that you were going to be signed out or that you were even signed out. And so what would happen, people would be signed out of Slack. They wouldn't realize like, oh, I'm signed out of Slack and everything's very quiet today. And they wouldn't know that they've been queuing up a lot of notifications. So for that reason, a lot of organizations left the session duration indefinite. Again, I would suggest making it reasonable and not active. And then you might want to have a slightly different approach on desktop versus mobile. There are a couple of different options here. One of them is to close, when you close the application, to terminate that session. So maybe the user closes the desktop app, for example, or they close the mobile app. That's going to, excuse me, not the mobile app. They close the browser tab they had open. That's going to close out the session in Slack. Then you can also set a minimum schedule. The minimum for that is 12 hours. So you can actually say, hey, after 12 hours, go ahead and sign this user out. You can use this in conjunction with the session reset API, which I'll talk about in a second, to sign users out if you need to. You can also set session duration per user, which is beneficial if you're on Enterprise Grid. You might have some users that are admins, or maybe they are having access to more sensitive information. Could be that they're on shared devices. For whatever the reason, you can actually set a shorter session duration for those users, or you could set one where, hey, those users, because they're on a shared device, we're going to go with whenever they close the app is when we're going to terminate their session. When it comes to endpoint security for mobile, there are a wide variety of options. And the reason we do this is because every organization is slightly different in how they approach mobile security. The most basic version of this are the set of policy options that exist within the Slack mobile app on the App Store. So this includes things like detecting blocking jailbroken devices. If there is one setting that's worthwhile and you don't have a full-blown EMM, that is probably the most important one to consider. That is because jailbroken devices represent the biggest security risk for organizations in terms of data exfiltration, right? So that could mean that that device is running malware without the user knowing it, because when it's jailbroken, you're allowed to run unsigned code and code from other app stores. Some of that code could have potentially malicious intent, including stealing tokens and content off the device itself, or even taking screenshots of the device. So by detecting and blocking those jailbroken devices, you're just adding one extra layer of protection. I will say Slack's jailbreak detection is not the industry best. There are cases, for example, where we still mark a device as jailbroken, even though it's been jailbroken and then returned back to a normal state. It's maybe no longer jailbroken. We'll still detect it as jailbroken, so we're a little bit sensitive in that regard. The best approach is definitely a mobile EMM provider. Those are things like Jamf or Mobile Iron, AirWatch. All of the app config partners, which you see listed on the screen here, are all supported by Slack through a EMM-specific Slack app that's, again, available in the Slack App Store. And that can be assigned through the MDM profile. The reason some organizations don't end up using EMM is because, especially in a BYOD environment, you really can't get your employees to enroll in EMM, right? It causes concern when the first thing that they see is, hey, by enrolling in this EMM, the administrator has access to wipe your device remotely, and they could wipe your camera roll and your text messages, et cetera. So for a lot of people, they just don't want to do that full enrollment in a mobile solution. So again, for those devices where it's BYOD, you don't have a mobile solution, there are a couple of other policy options that could be enabled on the App Store version of Slack, including block file downloads and message copy. So if you want to prevent people from, say, downloading files on their mobile devices, you can. You can require secondary authentication, which means that you actually require to enter a PIN before the Slack app will open. This is beneficial because you can actually prevent situations where somebody is not actively locking their phone. They leave it somewhere on a bar top or somewhere in a hotel room, and now the person that picked it up has full access to the device. They could pop open Slack, download content, especially if they had access to very sensitive content. That probably isn't something you want. The other thing that the secondary authentication also includes is the ability to suppress notification messages going to the device. So if you wanted to stop the previews, which you can see here, with this authentication enabled, you can actually stop the detailed notifications from being sent to the home screen. Again, beneficial if you don't enforce EMM. You can't enforce that the phone is locked. You can't enforce that you don't show previews when the phone is not in a lock state. So all reasons to consider that. You can also require a mobile browser version and a minimum mobile version if you require, say, a specific VPN on a browser for accessing SSO. The last option when it comes to mobile from a BYOD perspective is Microsoft Intune. This is available for enterprise-grade customers. If you are a Microsoft Intune customer, you can use Slack with what's called without enrollment. So for customers that want to bring your own device and they want a middle ground where they have a secure, encrypted enclave on the device, Microsoft Intune allows for what's called Intune without enrollment, which effectively allows that secure enclave on the device. You're running the Slack app from that secure enclave, from that encrypted enclave. You're also able to detect for jailbroken devices. You can remote wipe that container if you need to. You can prevent content from being shared and stored outside of that encrypted container. So it allows you to maybe enable downloads of files, but only to that secure enclave, so that if you needed to remote wipe it and you can make sure that that content didn't go anywhere else, you have that extra layer of protection. So again, 3 options: native app store, EMM, and Intune. When it comes to desktop, most customers employ some form of desktop monitoring. This is just generally a best practice. Device health tools like Cisco Duo, Okta has one called FastPass. Those can basically verify the state of the machine and make sure that some form of malware detection is running. And this is really important at time of session minting to make sure that the device has something like a CrowdStrike or some other anti-malware tool. One other thing of note that customers don't always realize is that for enterprise grid, Netscope, and Zscaler, both are reverse SSL proxies. They allow you to prevent employees from opening unapproved Slack workspaces. So if you're looking for a way to stop somebody from, say, opening a personal or a professional networking version of Slack on the same computer that they use to access their main Slack workspace, Zscaler and Netscope have options for doing that for you, and any other reverse SSL proxy that supports the xAllowed workspaces header. Lastly, when it comes to sessions and session management, terminating sessions is really valuable. Being able to either use the UI, which you can use to sign users out of mobile, desktop, or both mobile and desktop at the same time. Super beneficial if somebody lost their device, they lost their laptop or phone, you want to sign them out of all of those devices, you can. It also is a good practice when you're offboarding a user. If you're not using an automated process like Skim to offboard that user, you want to get them out of Slack as quickly as possible. this allows you to terminate that session and then lock their account. The session reset API itself allows you to, en masse, terminate all sessions of a particular user or to session invalidate a specific session. So you can actually say, I just want to stop the session on this one device that was lost. And again, this is all available through the command line, through the API. So you can tie that back with the ingestion into Splunk and automate the session resets through Splunk if you want to. All right, so now we've talked about getting users into Slack. We've talked about how to make sure that they're coming in from approved places, how to monitor what they're doing, kind of keep an eye on it. Now let's get into the dark art of governing and managing content. So if you're unfamiliar with Enterprise Grid as a concept, one of the things Enterprise Grid brings with it is the ability to have an overall organization. So normally on Pro and Business Plus, you end up with one workspace, and that's every place. That's everything. You've got all your public and private channels, your direct messages. With Grid, you can have an unlimited number of workspaces. The way most customers end up deploying Grid is they end up deploying it aligned to the lines of business that are communicating, collaborating together. And they think about it as and this is where the art comes into it. What are the groups of people that need to be working together frequently where they're sharing content, and thinking about limiting the potential radius for somebody to blast content out. So having a corporate workspace, for example, where only corporate-wide communications can be posted, and then maybe a sales workspace that's locked down and it's not visible to anybody else, or development workspace, allows you to defer the management of that workspace down to specific admins, but it also allows you to constrain exactly who has access to the quote-unquote public channels within that workspace. I saw Nicole's question, is anyone on Grid? Hopefully, if people aren't on Grid, this at least piques your interest to look into it.
I love
Yes.
I love the imagery, by the way, because I think sometimes it's hard to visualize all of this when we're so used to a one workspace environment. So I just want to call out the appreciation for a great visual as well.
Cool. Yeah, this is actually a pretty, I would say, generic and common approach, like especially having specific workspaces where Slack Connect is allowed and or where guests are allowed. Now, the other thing I'll mention is that this also applies to how you roll out retention. A very frequent question I get from customers, especially as they scale up the complexity of what they're adopting Slack for, if they start in using it for customer-facing data, for example, the retention period for that may be either shorter or longer, depending on what kind of regulations your company needs to adhere to. So if you need to adhere to FINRA, for example, you might have a 7-year retention period. If you're maybe worried about expiring, let's say, customer-facing information, you might want to restrict that down to 30 days or 60 days instead of having it. With Grid, you actually get the choice of how you deploy that retention down to a workspace and channel level. So if you wanted to, for example, you could have a workspace-specific approach for retention. So corporate might have a longer retention period because it's announcements, there's no other channels, only corporate-wide communications are going in there. Maybe that's a 6-month or year or 3-year or 7-year retention policy. It could be that in your service workspace where maybe you've got maybe PII content of some kind going in, that you expire that content in say 30 or 60 days, just so you have it off your plate. All of this works in conjunction with eDiscovery, and there's eDiscovery options that work both natively in Slack as well as third-party eDiscovery, and that goes hand in hand with just governing and managing content, because again, if you have any sort of litigation hold where you're expected to produce as a part of an eDiscovery process information from all your communication systems, Slack is oftentimes a part of that, and having options is beneficial. As far as data loss prevention, we also support what I'll call non-computationally intense data loss prevention in Slack. Why is it that fancy term for it? We actually block the message send pipeline before we send the messages in Slack. So we review all of the rules you've set up for what kinds of information are being shared, whether that's files being uploaded, content being added to Canvas, messages being shared. In all those cases, we actually quickly scan through all the rules you have and we compare it to the rules, and we make decisions about whether or not that content can be shared in the place that's being shared in. This goes hand in hand with third-party data loss prevention solutions. So you do have something like a SkyHigh or Netscope or Zscaler, there's other tools for DLP. You can join the two things together for deeper scanning. The benefit of the deeper scanning is that they tend to do more advanced analytics and heuristics. So they look for image matching, video matching, they might look for copyrighted materials, all of those sorts of good extended functionality that comes with a more advanced DLP. But to catch the 80-90% case, the Slack's native DLP is very beneficial. The most common approach I've seen for DLP, the rules that people tend to set up right away, disallow sharing of app tokens. So if you have like developers internally that are using app tokens for their apps, you may disallow the sharing of those tokens internally. And or if you have things like YubiKeys for developers, just preventing those things from accidentally being shared in channels can be a huge time saver for people. The other thing I'll mention for enterprise grade is that custom roles are a thing. So you don't have to give people broad enterprise-wide organizational administration. You can give them more refined access. One of the things that comes with enterprise grade is something called domain claiming. So if you have a problem where your users are frequently, inadvertently, or intentionally spinning up, we'll call them rogue workspaces, but they're workspaces that aren't necessarily governed by your central IT, by claiming the email domains that are associated with your account, you can actually redirect the process of creating a workspace back to your Slack instance. So if somebody tries to, with their corporate email address, create and spin up a new workspace, they'll just get redirected back into your Slack instance, allowing you to capture the request and then review whether or not you want to allow a new workspace to be created. The other benefit of domain claiming is that customers can block access to guest user invites for domains you've claimed. So one of the things that comes out often is, I don't want my employees to be represented as guests in remote workspaces because I don't know what they're doing in those remote workspaces. It's essentially a black box for me. And I don't know when that remote workspace will expire their user account. So for example, let's say I'm with Acme Corp, and Acme Corp, I get an invite to an external workspace. My account in that external workspace is good until that external workspace decides to expire it. So my contract, my employment might end with Acme Corp, but I'm still representing acmecorp.com email addresses in this remote workspace. So it's a reason to consider. Right now, it's very on or off, very binary. So you either turn on allowing guest user invites, or you can completely turn it off. But those are all based on the domains that you've claimed. E-discovery, I sort of touched on this earlier. The approach we've taken in Slack is to provide at the minimum the ability to collect, identify, collect, and preserve the content that you need for a legal hold. So you can put individual employees on legal hold. When you do so, we'll retain the content that that user is a part of in conversations in channel and direct messages, any files they upload, any edits, any reactions they put on messages. And then you can export that if you need for a e-discovery purpose. The benefit of a third-party e-discovery tool like a Smarsh and On-Air Global Relay is that they're more capable of allowing legal counsel to make decisions about what to include or exclude, and they tend to connect to a lot more sources than just Slack itself. So again, depending on your organization complexity and size, whether or not you end up with a lot of these litigation holds, there can be a benefit of supplementing the native e-discovery capabilities in Slack and the ability to put people on legal hold with the ability to actually use a tool like Smarsh, where you can cross-section horizontally across your organization. So think about, if I'm being asked to deliver all communications, that might include email, it might include my Google Workspace documents, it might include stuff from Confluence and other tools, not limited to just Slack. So that's a reason to consider that as an add-on. I talked about custom roles. I'm not going to drain this slide because there's way too many of them here, but there are a lot of individual administrative permissions that you can assign to groups and then assign users to those groups to grant them administrative control over objects in Slack. So for example, if I wanted to just limit the amount of analytics we could look at around a workspace or maybe channels, I can actually add those as permissions into a group and then assign that user to the group so they can do those functions. We added a ton more of those back in October of last year. So if you hadn't looked at it in a while, I definitely would suggest taking a look at custom roles. Again, they're currently available only for enterprise grid, but it is something that we're going to continue to expand over time. So expect to see even more of these role capabilities included. Managers are something that I just wanted to mention quickly and briefly. For enterprise grid specifically, you get the administrative APIs to actually potentially spin up and control a channel entirely through the API. What that means is you can use a system account to create the channel. That system account gets the role of the channel manager. And you can even do things like restrict whether or not other people can invite external folks to the channel or internal people. Even if you're not doing it through API, even if you're on a lower plan, just knowing that, hey, for these really sensitive channels, it may be worthwhile to make sure that the channel manager restricts the invitation of either internal or external people can be beneficial. I'll give you an example. If you're in a channel and you're having a performance management conversation about an individual, you might mention that individual as you're having the conversation. And Slack often helpfully says, oh, would you like to invite this person to the channel? The last thing you want to do is accidentally bonk the yes button or have someone else accidentally bonk the yes button and add them to that channel. It has happened in rare occasions, but it's just something worth mentioning. I sort of touched on the DLP earlier, just to give you a screenshot of what that looks like. Available out of the box for Enterprise Grid is this native data loss prevention capability. It works for both Slack Connect channels as well as internal channels. We also added recently an option to delineate between a public and private channel. So there might be things you allow inside of Slack, inside of private channels, maybe code words, certain app tokens, that sort of thing. But then inside of public channels, you never want to allow these things to be published. And so you can actually decide. And then there's a number of out-of-the-box detectors that we include. So you see the list on the right, including things like payment card information and PII information. What you do with the rule depends. So you can maybe silently alert an administrator, which will go to this console you see here. So you can review any of the rules that have triggered. You can show a warning to the user. This is really beneficial, especially I think the SSN one, because if you just mistype a phone number, for example, it's going to look like an SSN. So maybe what you want to do is just have the user double check the message before they send. So this is what it looks like when you're showing a warning to the user. And then there's the last option, which you see on the screen here. It says tombstone message, but effectively what that means is just block the message from being sent at all. So don't allow it to be sent, and then send that warning. In all three cases, that warning will go to this administrative console. With the customizable roles, you can actually select individuals from the organization that are able to see this console and then review the content, and then also have follow-up conversations if needed, or maybe even release the content if it was mistakenly added. Mentioned this on the prior slides, but we also integrate with third-party data loss prevention solutions. There's now well over, I think, closer to 20 different DLP solutions that we support out of the box. They all use the same APIs. However, some of them support an API extension that we actually added about a year ago, and that's the ability to prevent files from being shared until they're fully scanned by the DLP. So there are a handful of DLP providers. Unfortunately, I don't have that listed here. I probably need to go back and adjust this on my slide. But there are a handful of these providers that actually allow you to scan first and only share the file in the channel after it's been fully scanned by the DLP. The reason some customers don't want to do that is because DLP providers can sometimes take anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour to scan content, depending on the size of the file. So sometimes that can be a little problematic, but I did want to mention that there are some DLP integrations that support it. And then lastly, I think this is the very end of the slide deck, actually. This is related to security. Sometimes the threats are not detected by a DLP. Sometimes we can't tell that someone's intentionally trying to share content that they shouldn't. In some cases, it could be a physical threat, right? It could be somebody's actually suggesting harm against another, or maybe is saying something they really shouldn't be in a public context. So for that reason, there is the ability to flag messages. Those messages, as you see here, it just basically allows the user to suggest that someone takes a look at this message and then provides a quick reason why. Typically, what I see for larger organizations that toggle this on, and again, this is available for Enterprise Grid, is that they want a way to highlight those messages that maybe are getting missed by the DLP. They're just not being caught, and or they're physical threats. Especially in the prior cycle of everything being very politically heated, there's a lot of cases where HR might need to step in and maybe lock a thread in, say, a public channel, right? So typically the group of people that get notified about these flagged messages is a coordinated effort between HR and the security team, and the two review it together, because we don't know at the outset if the information that's being shared is related to a physical security threat, or is maybe harassing in nature, or if it's actually somebody shared something like a company confidential document into a public thread somewhere. All right, so in summary, if I wrap everything up, is number one, highly recommend the automated provisioning and deprovisioning of users, coupling that with an identity provider using an SSO with MFA enabled. If you're not able to do that, or if you don't have an SSO, at the very bare minimum, I do suggest looking at enforcing multi-factor authentication through Workspace It's just generally a good practice because it is easy to phish passwords. Second, looking at and monitoring for those anomalous sessions. And those session anomalies could be things where your employee is just doing something you don't want them to do, or it could be that their token or the device has been actively stolen, and now it's being utilized to exfiltrate content from your organization. Keeping an eye on either the access log if you're on Pro or the audit log if you're on Biz Plus and above is definitely a recommended approach. Limiting the session duration wherever it's feasible to reduce that risk of session reuse. You can tend to have a longer session if you are monitoring for those anomalous sessions, but it's just generally good practice. Securing those device endpoints, I can't say that enough, especially for mobile devices. That tends to be a vector for people to break into not only Slack, but other apps in your organization. Actively terminating those sessions that appear to be at risk, and then governing and monitoring what content's being shared in Slack. One last thing I would be remiss if I did not mention it is that Slack services actually allows you to optimize and design your security. So if you are looking for somebody to help you maybe do a full system architecture validation, look at what's going on from a channel management and security perspective, give you some stakeholder analysis with maybe some idea of how you're doing from a feature maturity perspective, give you some suggestions on how to approach governance, maybe even come up with some technical approaches using customization, maybe monitoring the DLP, for example. All that's available through the Slack technical account team and technical architects, rather. Definitely recommend it. Slack services is a great option there. And that is it. I wrapped it up with 5 minutes left for Q&A. I don't know if there's anything I didn't talk about in the course of this presentation that you were hoping to hear.
Personally, I feel like that was stellar. Timing and content. Let's see. We've got Joseph, Rico, Jen, and Adam. Any questions?
And given it's a small audience, I will accept any question of any kind, including if people want to know more about the metals behind me. I'm happy to talk about that. Sadly, it's not for security. So Rico asked, are there plans to roll out some of the enterprise level features in lower levels? We are always looking to bring every level up to the same maturity in terms of security. I don't have specific things I can share at this time around what we might be doing in the near future, but it is top of mind for us to just always review and revisit how we're deploying these features and making sure that we're not leaving anyone in the dark from a security perspective.
Awesome answer. Anything else? Got Steve for 3 more minutes, and he did offer any question he would respond to. I guess within reason, of course.
Within reason, yeah, exactly. Well, in the final closing, I just want to say thank you for having me. Thanks, Nicole, for inviting me. Will the slides we share? Yeah, I can share those through Nicole. There's a lot of links to documentation that are really beneficial. So I'll definitely share a PDF copy of this so you guys have access to that.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, and I will send that out, Steve, after you send, and then the recording once it's processed in the follow-up email for everyone. So very much appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And we'll talk very soon. Thank you very much.